We are starting with the pastry cream. For the pastry cream, it is super important that you have all of your ingredients measured out in advance. This is called the mise en place. There are times when we're doing multiple things at once. Things move pretty quickly. You will not have time to measure things out as you go. So we start by putting 3/4 of the milk and half of the sugar in a saucepan, and we are going to stir to dissolve that sugar. You can kind of feel it dissolve. It'll start out feeling kind of gritty as you stir, and then it'll get smoother, and it won't be gritty once the sugar is melted. Then we're going to bring that to a boil. At the same time, and in a different bowl, we mix the rest of the sugar and the cornstarch together and stir those with a whisk. We want to get these powders mixed together and smooth before we add our wet ingredients. This will prevent lumps, and it's easier to prevent lumps than to remove them later. Next, we will add our milk, and we're going to add this slowly while whisking. This will again prevent lumps. Lumps make bad pastry cream, they just do. And then after the milk, we're going to put in the eggs and the vanilla. We're going to continue whisking because we want to beat those eggs. The next step will be to combine these two sets of ingredients, the egg mixture and the milk and sugar, but we have to do it in a special way because if we heat these eggs up too quickly, they'll cook before everything else gets mixed in, and we'll end up with weird scrambled eggs instead of pastry cream. So the way that we do this to prevent them from getting too hot too quickly is called tempering. So we will take 1/3 of the milk and sugar mixture, and we will pour that into our bowl with the eggs while continuing to whisk. So it takes some coordination. We will set that saucepan back on the stove while we continue to whisk. We are bringing the eggs up to temperature basically, and now I'm adjusting my camera to go back to the saucepan, and now we will dump that bowl into the saucepan, continuing to whisk. And we're going to continue to whisk. We are letting it all cook together, letting it all mixed together, and feeling it thicken. And I love the way it feels as it thickens. We know it's done when it leaves a tail behind. This is really hard to see in the light in this, but basically, when you're stirring a liquid, you can see kind of the ripples that your spoon leaves behind and how they almost immediately disappear. We're waiting for that ripple that your whisk leaves to kind of stay in place. And I sped up the playback speed, so it's kind of hard to see, but I stopped periodically for just a split second to check for that. Once it's thick enough, the next step is to cool it down, and we want to cool it down in a controlled way. So we do this with an ice water bath. I use a set of casserole dishes to do this. So they're a set, so they fit together really well. I'll put the paste. You'll see right now that there's a smaller pan inside another one. Right now there isn't any liquid in the other one because if you put the water in first, then it moves around and it's a little bit trickier. So I'm putting the pastry cream in that smaller casserole pan. And then I'm going to spread it out evenly in kind of a thin layer. This will help it cool down more quickly. Then in that bigger pan, I'm putting ice cubes and some cold water. This is called an ice water bath, and it can be used to cool anything down. You do want to make sure that you are using tempered glass if your pans are glass. This is glass that's been treated so that it doesn't shatter in drastic temperature changes. And once this stops steaming, I'm going to put some saran wrap or press and seal on it. But you know how you usually put the saran wrap or the plastic wrap around the edges of the pan? We are not doing that here. If we did that, then we'd get this weird film on top of our pastry cream, and no one likes that weird film. So instead, we are going to put the press and seal directly on the surface of the pastry cream so that this pastry cream does not contact in air, and so we don't get that film. Then once we've done that, we will pop it in the fridge and your pastry cream is done. It's ready to use when you are. Stop and wash your dishes. And pastry cream will keep in the fridge for up to 3 days. I made this on the first day of making these pain au raisin and finished everything on the second. The dough does take like more than a day because it has to sit overnight at one point. So you don't want to make this pastry cream too far in advance. That's why I'm not giving you guys exactly the whole recipe now. I want you to wait until you have all the pieces that you need at once. Congratulations, you just made pastry cream. This is an excellent time to stop and wash your dishes. If your parents looked at all scared when you told them that you were going to cook, it's probably because they imagined you walking away from the kitchen and it looking like a disaster area. Stop, wash your dishes now. Clean as you go. It makes everything else easier and it will make your continued cooking way less stressful. Wash your dishes. We'll be back soon. The next thing we're going to do, hi Ben, is the poached raisins. This is like the easiest thing, the easiest part of this recipe. You put everything in a saucepan. You make it boil. And once it's boiling, you take it off the heat, cover it in plastic wrap, let it sit for an hour. And then you just pop it in the fridge and it's ready to use when you're ready to use it. Easiest thing ever. It's great. Once you're done, wash your dishes before you move on. Now we are on to our dough, and this is croissant dough, so it combines two things. It's yeast, which is not always typical of doughs that involve like butter and laminating process, and that laminating process, which we'll get to a little bit. So to start, we are putting pretty much all of our ingredients into a mixer. I couldn't find malt syrup, and so what I did was I combined equal parts of honey and molasses. I wouldn't do it again. I think the molasses made it much harder to mix. The other thing I would do differently next time is cut the butter that's going into the dough right now into smaller pieces so that it mixes a little bit better. Combination of the molasses and those bigger pieces of butter made the dough come together really quickly, but also before the butter was fully incorporated into the dough. So the first step to making this dough is mixing it together. This is a kind of dough that has a lot of times where like you do a little thing and then you wait. You do a little thing and then you wait. So once we have it all mixed together, we are going to prepare a lightly floured surface for it to sit and rest on while it rises. And we're going to let it rise for 2 hours. This is the first of those chunks of time where you're going to sit and let it do nothing. Well, you don't have to do anything with it, but there's stuff happening in the bread. The yeast is making it rise so that you eventually end up with the right texture. If you have a proofing drawer or a proofing oven, that would be a great place to put it. Ideally, this is done at about 75 degrees, like room temperature. If you don't, you can just put it on your table and leave it at room temperature. It might take a little bit longer if your thermostat is set lower than that. Mine was. It still worked. And while it is proofing, you will cover it with a towel. So after 2 hours, you'll come back to your dough and you'll see that it's bigger than it was before. And then you will put it on a baking sheet, 12 by 16 inches. You'll roll or pat your dough out to fill that baking sheet. You'll cover it in plastic wrap, press and seal, whatever you have, and then you'll put it in the fridge. And it's going to hang out in the fridge overnight. This is why this recipe takes 2 days. For this next step, I thought I recorded it, but something went wrong and it didn't record, so I'm just going to have to explain it. In this step, we are preparing our butter. This is for that lamination process. So basically, we want to get layers of butter, or dough, butter, dough, butter, dough, butter, dough. And we want that butter to stay cold while we're doing this because we don't want it to melt at all until it's in the oven. That melting and evaporating of the butter is what makes the layers of dough go like and open up, and that's what gets that flakiness and the texture of a croissant. So we're gonna take cold butter. We take our cold butter and we're going to slice it like the long way so that I can get about 4 long strips of butter per stick of butter. Then you're going to have multiple sticks of butter for this. It takes a lot of butter. That's what makes it delicious. Lots of butter. You're going to lay out your long pieces of butter on a table. Then you're going to use a rolling pin to roll it into one mass. And you eventually want this mass of butter to be half the size of the dough rectangle. You will see what that looks like when it's all done in the next video, because the putting it in the fridge part recorded, go figure. That's the part that is easiest to just explain. This is what your butter will look like when it's done and enclosed in press and seal. This is why I really love press and seal for baking. It makes it super easy to enclose stuff. And we're putting this in the fridge, and it's gonna hang out in the fridge overnight. This is why this takes 2 days. Wash your dishes, you're done for today. So it's the dough and the butter having to be in the fridge overnight that makes this recipe take so long. If you wanted to, you could get the dough and the butter started on day 1 and do everything else on day 2. I liked doing most of the things on day 1, like the pastry cream and the raisins and getting the dough started. It just made day 2 go a little more smoothly. Day 2 is when it gets especially piddly with working with the dough, sticking it back in the fridge. Working with the dough, sticking it back in the fridge. It was nice to have the pastry cream and the raisins already out of the way. The apricot glaze you cannot do in advance. Number 1, it needs to go on the pastries while they are hot. Number 2, it needs to go on the pastries while it is hot. This is not something, the glaze does not reheat well, so you have to use it pretty much right after you made it. So that is the one thing that you absolutely have to do right before you need it. Luckily, it's not that hard. So that's it for day 1. We have done everything that we can for this day. The next class period, so this will be posted on Thursday. The next video will be posted on Monday. We will finish up the dough and we'll do the glaze, and then I will give you my review. Okay. Au revoir, bonne journée.